The way to perfection is narrow and steep.
The bypaths are many.
The pitfalls are deep. By theory alone, many think to arrive. Here's one who could teach them if he were alive. A philosopher stepped into a boat, the river to cross with he. So learned was he thought no man could be half so clever as he. Singing wise-o with his book so, such a mighty scholar was he. Singing wise-o with his book so, such a mighty scholar was he.
To the boatman he said,
Good man, pray tell, of the German philosophers three, Schopenhauer, Hegel, and weighty Kant, whom you deem the wisest to be.
Singing wise-o with his book so, such a mighty scholar was he. Singing wise-o with his book so, such a mighty scholar was he. Please excuse me, sir,
and the boatman said,
I've not read your philosophers three. All day I'm obliged to ply these oars to support my family and me. Singing wise-o with his book so, such a mighty scholar was he. Singing wise-o with his book so, such a mighty scholar was he.
In that case, my good man, your wretched life is as good as a quarter lost. Why, without the writings of those three men, not a shelf of books would I trust.
Singing wise-o with his book so, such a mighty scholar was he. Singing wise-o with his book so, such a mighty scholar was he.
Now then tell me, good man,
the scholar said,
have you studied the Frenchman, Descartes?
I told you before.
the other cried,
I'm unschooled, hard work is my art. Singing wise-o with his book so, such a mighty scholar was he. Singing wise-o with his book so, such a mighty scholar was he.
Hard work, what a waste, sad foolish man. And your life has been thrown of hay. Yet still, the fragment might be redeemed. Memorize one theory a day.
Singing wise-o with his book so, such a mighty scholar was he. Singing wise-o with his book so, such a mighty scholar was he. Of a sudden a storm with raging might did lash the river to foam. Like a drifting pedal it tossed their boat till it seemed they'd never get home. Singing wise-o with his book so, such a mighty scholar was he. Singing wise-o with his book so, such a mighty scholar was he.
and the boatman cried,
My learned sir, our chances are growing dim. 2 questions you put me so far this trip. Now I'll ask you one. Can you swim? Wise-o with his book so, such a mighty scholar was he. Singing wise-o with his book so, such a mighty scholar was he.
I can't swim a stroke!
the scholar cried as he clung in despair to an oar.
Then the whole of your life is lost, my friend. You'll not need those books anymore. Singing wise-o with his book so, such a mighty scholar was he. Singing wise-o with his book so, such a mighty scholar was he. The boatman regrets to say his fare, never reached the opposite bank. All that ponderous learning inside his head gave him weight to sea, and he sank. Singing wise-o with his book so, such a weighty scholar was he. Singing wise-o with his book so, such a weighty scholar was he. La 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 la.
Good morning. I'd like to welcome all of you to Sunday service, especially all our guests and our guests over the internet. It's a marvelous, balmy day in the winter here at Ananda. And I'd like to read from Rays of the One Light, commentaries by Paramahansa Yogananda, written by Swami Kriyananda. This week's reading is By Thinking Can We Arrive at Understanding? Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. There are many places in the Gospels where we see Jesus in open conflict with the Pharisees. That is to say, with man-made as opposed to true mystical tradition. In the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 15, we see a good example of how they and he locked horns. Then some of the scribes and Pharisees from Jerusalem came and asked Jesus, "Why do your disciples break our ancient tradition and eat their food without washing their hands properly first?" Jesus, after scolding them for their hypocrisy in observing lesser rules so carefully while ignoring the much more important ones, said, "Listen and understand this thoroughly. It is not what goes into a man's mouth that makes him common or unclean. It is what comes out of a man's mouth that makes him unclean." It wasn't that Jesus counseled against such wholesome practices as washing one's hands before eating. In an age, however, when lesser rules were given too much importance relative to the truly important observances, cleaning the heart of impure desires, for example, he emphasized the supreme importance of loving God and of communing with him. The Pharisees, the orthodox religionists of his day, in other words, had brought true religion down to a level of intellectual hair-splitting. They mistakenly considered the way to understanding to lie through a minefield of definitions which they tried to refine to ultimate exactitude. Jesus taught, however, that the intellect alone can never lead one to truth. Without love, indeed, there is no ultimate verity. Without fixity of purpose, born of the heart's devotion, the intellect wanders endlessly. It cannot settle for long on anything. As the Bhagavad Gita says in the 2nd chapter, the intellect of those who lack fixity of spiritual purpose are inconstant, their interests endlessly ramified. Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Om, Om, Om.
No, that can stay. Good morning. For those who don't know us, my name is Anandi, and this is my husband, Bharat. And I'll begin by reading from Whispers from Eternity. This is a book of poems and prayers by Paramahansa Yogananda. This one is called, I Want to Feel Thee Just Behind the Voice of My Prayer. O Father, Thou art just behind my vision, with which I see Thy beauty without. Thou art just behind my listening power, with which I hear Thy voice in all creation. Thou art just behind my touch, with which I feel Thy world. In the sweetness of flowers and in the zest of sustaining food lies hidden the essence of Thy being, Thine eternal sweetness. Thou art just behind the voice of my prayer. Thou art just behind the mind with which I pray. Thou art just behind my glistening feelings. Thou art just behind my thoughts. Thou art just behind my cravings for Thee. Thou art just behind my meditations. Thou art just behind the veil of nature's splendors. Thou art just behind the screen of my love. Behind all these mystic screens, reveal Thyself as Thou art. This morning's reading on By Thinking Can We Arrive at Understanding was especially focused on understanding the scriptures, but I would like to talk about it a little bit more broadly. understanding our lives, understanding how to make our lives draw closer to God, and the role of thinking in that. Someone said once, many people want to serve God, usually in an advisory capacity. And it is certainly true that we have a very high regard for our own thinking ability, our own opinions. And yet, far from taking us to God, it actually acts as a screen that keeps us from God. Many of you probably have heard of the book called My Stroke of Insight. And if you haven't heard of it, I really recommend it highly. It's by a woman named Dr. Jill Bolt Taylor. And she is a neuroanatomist. In other words, specializes in the study of the brain, and she had a stroke at the age of 32. And what happened was she woke up with a migraine, what she thought was a migraine. Her head was hurting a lot, and so she did a little exercise, which didn't help, and got in the shower. And she was standing in the shower, things started to be a little strange. And since her specialty was the brain, she was trying to figure out what was going on and sense what was happening. And what was happening was basically she had a very rare hemorrhage in the left side of the brain, a very rare kind of stroke. And the left side of her brain, the part of our brain that does the thinking, was shutting down. And her whole perception of life was changing. And this is what she says about it. Obviously, this was looking back, but it's quite a fascinating and inspiring book. Here's what she said happened as her thinking part of her brain shut down. Her thoughts were no longer a constant stream of chatter about the external world and her relationship to it. That stream of chatter, a constant part of our days, ceased entirely. With it came a growing sense of peace. She felt enfolded by a tranquil euphoria, felt an expanding sense of grace. Instead of being locked into being Jill and all that defined Jill, she felt a sense of being at one with the universe, totally in the present and in the presence of grace. That sounds pretty good, doesn't it? It kind of makes you want to excise the left side of your brain. But the problem was that she would have, without medical treatment, she would have died, because you can't just simply shut down the left side of your brain. And she ended up really coming back to having the abilities of a very young child, and she had to relearn everything, which took her about 8 years. And she had to make a decision in that relearning that she was going to sacrifice the euphoria that she felt in order to participate in life. But there's more to the story, I won't go into that, but this presence of God, this divine bliss that is our definition of God, existence, consciousness, and bliss, it lives in us all the time, but it's cut off. It's hidden by this constant stream of chatter, this constant thinking. There was a woman who was here on a first-timers retreat recently, and when I asked people to share how they came onto the spiritual path, she told an amazing story. She was born in Iran and was very devotional as a child, but then she got married and moved to Canada with her husband, had 3 children, got very, very busy, and God sort of slipped to the side. And as she was studying to become a doctor of philosophy in the subject of biochemistry, she was studying really, really hard. She was trying to memorize everything for her upcoming oral exams. And her husband had a trip he was going on for business to the west side of Canada and asked her to come. And she didn't want to leave the house. She was afraid that the stuff that was in her brain would just be lost, like it would fall out if she left the house. But she went, and he promised her she could stay in the hotel room and just study. And that's what she did. She never left the hotel room. And so finally on the last day, he said, "Look, we're here near the Canadian Rockies. Let's just take a walk for one day." So she, with some trepidation, she left her books, and she went with him But when she got to the Rockies, to the edge of this path heading up through the foothills of the Rockies, something happened, and she just started climbing very, very quickly up the mountain. She said, like a mountain goat. She just was way, way ahead of her husband. And she got to the peak of that mountain, and she felt within herself this enormous sense of expansion. And she felt the presence of God. And she just felt like everything in her life changed. She didn't care at all about her exams. They just dropped behind her. And she just clung to that feeling of that divine power within her. Well, the interesting thing was, not surprisingly, when she went back and she took her oral exams, she said she was standing there and she was so conscious of God's presence and had so much power and magnetism that she just sailed through them without her facts, without her thinking, but with the inspiration. Now, obviously, she'd invested and she knew all that material, but that power of God, that presence, is what gives our life power, and it's what moves us in the direction we want to go. When Swami Kriyananda created the purification ceremony about 25 years ago, we were the ministers in Palo Alto, and we'd never done anything like a ceremony like this. And I said to Swami, well, what exactly are we doing? What are we supposed to be doing there? And Swami said, just ask that the light flow through you. Do not think about what you think this person needs for their spiritual welfare. You know how we all do that. Oh, he really needs to open his heart, or she needs more strength, whatever. That is what blocks the energy of God. Just focus on the light and let that shine through you. And that is, of course, Swami gives us just the perfect example of that in his life. He was, when he was in college, he was very intellectual, very, very smart, and very proud of his intelligence. And since he came to Master, he totally worked on his meditation, on his devotion, and really spent his time lifting his consciousness above the level of thinking and trying to attune always to the flow of grace. And that's how he lives now, with all the things he's accomplished, the books and the communities and all the different projects that he started and completed. It doesn't come from thinking. It comes from inspiration. A friend of ours named Padma was in Italy with him in the 80s when we were just starting our community in Italy, and it started up at Lake Como, and Padma was there as Swami was talking to the woman who was lending us her house to live in, and it was a kind of a sensitive and tricky discussion that he needed to have with her, trying to get her to support us by making the house more livable. It was freezing in that house. And how was he going to do that and so on? Well, anyway, they were just having this very affable lunch, and Swami said something which seemed to Padma to come completely from left field. And yet, after he said it, suddenly the whole conversation shifted around. The woman started coming up with many ideas about how she could help us make the house warmer and more livable. And Padma was inwardly going, wow, that was a very brilliant stroke of negotiation. And when they left, Swami said to her, I know you think that I was a very brilliant negotiator in that situation, but he said, that's not what happened at all. He said, I just listen to Divine Mother, and I just say whatever she tells me to say. I just keep my mind tuned upwardly. And that's what we're trying to do. It's much more powerful than thinking. It's much more fun than thinking, and it draws us much closer to God than thinking. I had this image come to me, and about the role of thinking, and I'd like to share it. If you would imagine the shape of an hourglass, has the bowl below and the bowl above, and a little narrow part at the middle. And if you would think of the bowl on the bottom as the subconscious mind, which of course stores all of our memories and habits and so forth, but is also the part of our mind that is the most resistant to change. It's a part of ourselves that when we hear ourselves whining, when we hear ourselves being resentful or negative or critical. It's coming from the subconscious mind. When we reach blocks, when we feel stuck, when we feel like we can't move forward, that's the inspiration, so to speak, coming from the subconscious mind. And the top bulb is our superconscious mind. This is huge and unmeasurable, but the superconscious mind is where we attune to God, where we feel God's presence. And that part of our being, this part that comes from inspiration and divine guidance and just being open to life, very much like the song that David led us in, None Can Atone Me. I'm just part of life. All of life is about growing and change, and I'm joyfully participating in it. That's the superconscious, and it brings us solutions, and it changes ourselves, it changes our lives, it transforms us. Well, think of the conscious mind as that little narrow part between the two. And the conscious mind, the thinking part of our mind, can really be well used if it can hear the voice of whining, even if it's a silent whining. Hear the voice of resentment. Hear the I don't want to, I can't, this is impossible. And if the conscious mind, the thinking mind, can note it and say, oh, I'm being trapped now by my past, by my subconscious, what can I do to lift my mind? Then we start to see some really amazing and wonderful changes happening in our life. During Inner Renewal Week, Devi referred to a prayer of Yogananda's that I'd reminded her of. It was very, very simple. Yogananda said that if you are having difficulties with another person, some kind of friction, things just are not working, what you should do is for 1 minute, you should focus on that person and you should pray, Lord, fill him with peace and harmony. Peace and harmony. You just keep repeating that and visualizing them in goodness and light and praying that they be filled with peace and harmony for 1 minute. And then for 15 seconds, you pray, Lord, fill me with peace and harmony. Peace and harmony. And Yogananda promises if you do this 5 times a day, it will definitely work. Well, what's very interesting about that prayer to me is that in the last 6 months or so, I've been sharing that with people in counseling sessions and classes. And the response has been basically breathtaking. I mean, I get these emails back of complete reversals in people's lives because they, instead of listening to the, I really hate this person, or they're really, really making my life miserable, they use their thinking process to say, no, I want to shift to a different way of looking at this. And things changed. One woman, very, very new to the path, I've never even met her, I counseled her from Sacramento on the phone, started using this, and she said to me, I was praying for my supervisor at work, who's a very aggressive, one of those kind of, climbing the ladder of success people, and very hard to live with. And she left the company. Strange. You don't really know what's going to happen when you do these prayers. It was like a shock to everyone. The woman just left. But for most people, what happens, and I just got an email yesterday from someone in Kentucky who was having a difficulty. She's a teacher, and one of the other teachers at our school was really kind of taking advantage of her good nature and putting a lot of her own responsibilities onto my friend, and it was getting really frustrating, and more than anything, it was keeping her from doing what she needed to do with her own students. And she was really just frustrated and just couldn't get out of the box of that problem. And 1 week later, after doing that prayer, I got this email, and she just said, things are just changing. The woman, she saw a kindness in the woman that she'd never seen before. She started to see the whole situation from a perspective of gratitude and blessing. blessing of what was happening for her, blessing of what was happening for the students because of the situation. And it all just reversed into a transformative situation for her instead of a block. So that is hiding. It's hiding behind our thinking processes. It's there all the time, that power of God. A couple of years ago, a woman came here, and she told me about a problem at work that had been a problem for 10 years. Another woman, again, was taking advantage of her, and this time the effect on her was actually a financial effect. It was actually hurting her financially. She felt very, very bad about it, and she couldn't change the situation. And so we were talking about it, and I couldn't see how she could change the situation either. It seemed pretty bad. And she left, and as I was reviewing our conversation, the thought came very, very strongly, God is stronger than this test. God is stronger than this test. And I phoned her up and said, I think you should meditate on this. And she left me a voicemail 2 days later. Mind you, 10 years, 2 days later, she left me a voicemail. And she said, this morning, this woman knocked on my door and she said, what can we do to work together more harmoniously? So the thinking power is very, very limited, but the power of God is unlimited. And I think if we want to remember anything from this service, if we can remember God is stronger than this test, it will be a very, very good thing. I had a beautiful experience happen in my own life, a very, very important one to me this was about 4 years ago or 5 years ago. As I was growing up, I always knew that I would be the one to figure out how to take care of my mother as she got elderly. And for many years, I would ponder this problem, and I would think about this problem, and I would kind of float out various things and try to have a little conversation with her about this. And the conversations all ran the same way. I don't want to think about it. I want to stay where I am. End of story. So that was all fine, and that's what was happening. And at age 92, she was living in her house in St. Louis. It was a 2-story house with a basement and an attic, so 4-story house. She was driving her own car, and I was in California. And more and more wondering what was going to happen. She had a couple of trips to the emergency room. She had none of her kids were around. No close family was around. That was just her in the house that she had lived in for 60 years, and that's what she wanted to do. Well, that was all fine. And then I get this phone call from my sister, who is a nurse who specializes in home care for the elderly, assessing their situations. And she and my brother, who is a physician who works with elderly people, were really alarmed. And they kept hammering on my mother that she needed to change and she should come live with my brother, she should do this, she should move here, she should do all this stuff. And they were meeting the brick wall. So they call me, you're the oldest, she'll listen to you. Ha ha ha. I knew that wasn't true. But their anxiety came into me. I'd been worried because I'd been calling her daily for a long time just to keep apprised. But now I was really, really anxious. And I felt helpless because I was in California and so on. I went into the temple, my meditation room, and I laid it in Yogananda's lap. And I just said, what do? I don't know how to handle this. I really have no ideas. I have no thoughts. I can't figure out what to do. And I put it completely into his hands. And I felt within me a deep sense of calmness and a sense that, he didn't say it verbally, but I could feel the words, this is going to be just fine. So I went in the house and I phoned my mother. I said, I know you don't want to move or change, and I'm totally following that. That's totally fine. But how about if I come to St. Louis for a week and you and I will just research what's out there. And then if you ever decide you want to move, then we'll know. So we'll just do a little research trip. She likes having me visit, so that was fine. So I went there. And the whole time I was going there and I was there, I held on to that feeling, Master has this in hand, it's all fine. The first day we had a very unsuccessful day, and the second day we went to this place which had 400 small apartments that were like kind of as part of this magnificently beautiful facility. As we were wandering around, I could feel something kind of shifting in my mother. I never the whole week said anything about you should. I just said, what do you think? And that was my, all week it was, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? So anyway, we're here and we find, and they say, well, we have a 30-day experimental trial. You can live here for 30 days, try it out and see what you think. I said to her, what do you think? She said, why not? I said, okay. So by the end of my 7 days in St. Louis, she was moved into what became the apartment she stayed in for the last years of her life, to a facility that she was very, very happy in. And it all just, it couldn't have been more beautifully handled. Certainly not by me. But by God's grace, all these things can be handled beautifully. In the Bhagavad Gita, it says, there is within us a natural flow of energy upward toward God. And spiritual development is a matter of learning how to relax into that upward flow. There's also a flow that blocks that, an outward flow, which includes the thinking as well as desires and so on. But what we can do as devotees, if we tune into this, is we can let go of that process and learn to relax into that upward flow and find that God is just there waiting for us, saying, I can help you if you only let me do it. Let's meditate on this for a few moments.
Send all